More than 5 million additional people filed for first-time unemployment last week, which brings the total jobless number to 22 million. The very companies that laid off their own employees and will receive trillions of dollars in bailouts are allowed to pay their investors dividends. So these are two different stories, but they're very much involved they're very much connected, because on one hand, you have 22 million Americans who not only lost their jobs, but in many cases lost their health care coverage, which was given to them by their employer. And then at the same time, those same employers could then turn around and take the bailout money that the stimulus package granted them to buy shares of their own stocks, or in this case, pay dividends to their investors. And I want to give you more details on that. Zach Carter, by the way, at Huffington Post has been absolutely killing it with these reports.
Look, I want to be clear about a couple of things here. First of all, on the unemployment numbers, you could actually take unemployment now because of the new laws, even if you're a contractor or a part-time employee. So it might not be quite as dire as those numbers indicate, but even if it's not quite as dire, it's still really, really dire. And the second part of it that some reports mention, but most don't, is every time somebody's laid off, they also lose their insurance. So yeah, employees do, a lot of employees, not all, offer COBRA while you're laid off, but that is very expensive. So now we're going to get to a story about that a little bit later, but these unemployment numbers are disastrous. I have a nuanced take on Zach's story about the dividends as well, but why don't you explain further, Anna?
Yeah, sure. So before we get to the dividends, I do want to just show you a little bit of the failing leadership that we're dealing with here. So Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin was asked about the state of the economy back in March, okay? Not too long ago, March 18th, but it does feel like a million years ago right now, considering the social distancing that everyone's experiencing. So here he is talking about the state of the economy. This is on March 18th.
Used a number, and it's been quoted, maybe 20% people laid off. Well, that's FDR. That's the Great Depression, not the Great Recession. When you say that, of course, it trembles in fright through so many hardworking Americans. Is there a way to cut that down?
Jim, I want to be very clear because I've seen that number in the press, okay? And I didn't in any way say I think we're going to have that. And let me be clear. If we follow the president's plan, we will not have it. What I said was just a mathematical statement, which is 40% of the people that are employed in the private workforce are employed by companies 500 people and less. It was just a mathematical statement to say, if half these people were to lose their jobs, this is what it would be. But we're not going to let that happen. Okay. The president has said, we're going to make sure that companies have money so that they continue to pay those employees.
That did not age well. So 22 million people have filed for unemployment, but there's a huge caveat to that number. You need to consider how difficult it is for people to file unemployment in their own states right now. The systems are overburdened. They weren't prepared for the huge influx of people trying to sign up for unemployment insurance. And so the number is likely higher than the 22 million that I mentioned. And the statement that he just made about how Trump has a plan in place and they're not going to allow these businesses to suffer. Cenk, you're a small business owner. Why don't you jump in and tell us what the reality is?
Yeah, the CARES Act provided money for small business owners. They ran out of money today. And a huge percentage of small businesses did not get the money. So you just said, oh, sorry, we ran out. Congress might or might not pass a new law. Did they run out of money for big businesses? Hell no. Big business always has enough money, and they can fire their employees and give their money to shareholders, whereas small businesses must keep their employees, which is a good thing. You should apply to big business as well. But even if you did, they're like, psych, we're just kidding. We ran out of money. So they let all of that happen. And then the small business owners that do employ so many people, as Mnuchin, that's the one correct thing that he said, now have to let more people go. So it's disaster on top of disaster. If they really don't replenish that stock after they made the promises to small business owners, there'll be way more people laid off next week.
Yeah, exactly. And just to give you the numbers, there was $350 billion set aside to help small businesses. In order for small businesses to qualify for that money as a grant as opposed to a loan, they had to avoid firing or laying off a single employee. Many businesses followed suit, hoping that they would qualify for that money. But as you mentioned, Cenk, that money has already run out. When it comes to massive corporations, companies that employ more than 500 employees, there is literally trillions of dollars set aside to bail these people out. And what can these companies do with that money? They can pay dividends to their shareholders, even as they are laying off their employees. So Zach Carter at Huffington Post reports, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell continues to let the biggest banks in the country cut checks to their shareholders, aka rich people, in the parlance of our times, as a matter of routine. Almost half of all dividend income flows to the top 1% of income earning households, while less than 8% of households in the bottom 60% earn any dividend income at all. Also, it's important to note that there was very little fight in Congress in order to prevent this from happening, right? So Congress could have written this legislation in such a way where bailed out companies would not be allowed to pay dividends to their investors. But no one fought this, including some of the progressives we love. You know, oftentimes people think that we're nothing more than hacks for people like Bernie Sanders. That's not the case here. Not only did House Speaker Nancy Pelosi go along with this nonsense, but populists like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders certainly didn't fight it either. Also, the restrictions on dividend payouts to shareholders, even for companies that receive a bailout from the coronavirus bill, only apply to airlines and national security critical businesses. A lot of firms are about to lay off a bunch of workers to cut costs while sending checks to their shareholders. Congress and the Trump administration are letting it happen.
All right, quick comment about the Democrats. Then when we do criticize Bernie Sanders or AOC, people are like, how dare you? Well, which one is it? So we're going
to be honest. We're going to be honest.
Yeah.
So go ahead and get mad about it.
Yeah. So in this case, AOC actually gave a great fiery speech before the vote. Now, the problem is with all of the progressives, they have the right ideas. And AOC, Bernie Sanders, Jayapal, wonderful job in putting those ideas forward, putting the legislation forward. But when Pelosi says no, everybody falls in line. And the thing they'll never tell you, and I'll tell you, is Pelosi is corrupt. Pelosi and the Democratic leadership and Schumer and all those people, they take giant donations from those giant banks that Zach Carter's writing about. Does that influence them? 100% it influences them, completely and utterly. Okay, so we got more on that later in the show. You miss any part of the show, become a member, get it all. tyt.com/join. Okay, now one more thing about Zach's piece. Look, guys, if a company doesn't take any bailout money at all, or the money is not flowing through them. So let's say a company like Zoom that's doing well, that's doing better in this circumstance because more people are using it, and they didn't take any bailout money, and they want to give dividends. Well, have at it, Hoss. There's no problem with that. And Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, said, hey, look, this is capitalism. But wait a minute. Yeah, that's capitalism. But if someone is giving out dividends and they did take bailout money, that's not capitalism. That's socialism. You took taxpayer money and you gave it to those corporations. Then you don't get to say, hey, capitalism, baby, they gave it away all to the rich. Ha ha. No. That's our money. Okay. Now, in the case of the banks specifically here, the money flows through them. So it's a little bit more complicated. But the Federal Reserve offers up a giant amount of money to the banks. The idea that the banks are, out of the goodness of their heart, going to have more easily available credit is preposterous. That doesn't happen. But the banks do facilitate loans. And so they have giant advantages that arise out of the bailout money. So should they be restricted in giving out dividends since the taxpayers are funding a huge part of that? I think the answer is yes. But obviously, the politicians who take money from those same banks say no. And how about the Federal Reserve? If you missed my interview with Nomi Prince, you should check it out on The Conversation. You can get that on YouTube or tyt.com. But if you don't know, the Federal Reserve is just the big banks. The New York Federal Reserve, for example, their board is made up of the big giant banks. So the head of the banks says the banks should be able to pay dividends to their shareholders. Of course he does. Jerome Powell's not some disinterested referee. He's basically the servant of the banks. So they've decided, yes, we will print more money and give it to ourselves and put no restrictions on it.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.